All right. The idea of living in communes is nothing new, and it still goes on today. When I was a young man, some people I knew got together and they rented a mansion that once belonged to a millionaire. There were 12 of them, one married couple. The married man was the one in charge, 5 unmarried men and 5 unmarried women. And they got together in a commune. It did not last but a few months. The person I was a school teacher at the time, a person I was teaching with declined to join. He said it just had the appearance of having illicit sex going on, which I don't think went on in this commune, especially since the bunch of them together who lived there did not get along at all. But here was the problem that, I commuted with 2 of the women who were in it, and they would talk about it in my presence. I was not invited to join, maybe because I was too much of a deviant. I don't care, I don't know. I'd be better off not joining. But anyway, the 2 women, one woman said, it's like being crucified. So the director, he was being fair. This week, you would do the dishes. Next week, you would wash the windows. The next week, you'd vacuum the carpet. He rotated the jobs, so everybody got their turn at every job. But here's what this woman said. It's not that the work is hard, it's just the fact that I have to do it. Well, if you're living by yourself, or you're living with your spouse or your children, if you don't want to do the dishes, you can let them wait. And if you don't want to mow the grass today, well, I just don't feel, I'm not going to mow it. But if you're living in a commune, you've got to do the assigned work whether you want to or not. And that's what made it feel like, just feel like being crucified. Just the idea that I have to do it. Well, but here's what really destroyed the commune, folk. And some get a laugh every time I say this. One of the unmarried women was a little bit more attractive than the other ones. And all the men noticed it. And the other 4 women were extremely jealous. This girl would ask would say, I'm thirsty. And 5 unmarried men would jump and almost trip over each other, try to be the first one to get her a glass of water. And the other women were extremely jealous of her. Well, finally, one of them moved out, then another moved out. It was the women, folk, who really did more than anything else to break up the commune. That's just simply stating what I could observe from a distance. Of the 2 women I commuted with, one of them is now 67 years old, will turn 68 this year, sometime this year. The other one's about 74, neither one of them have ever been married. Take that for whatever it's worth. It might have done them more harm than good. I don't know. Now, okay, while I'm on the subject, there's one commune that I know of where the people practiced, and it was a large commune, it actually worked. That lasts to this day. And we'll talk about them doing it. But anyway, the commune was the Mormons. And I wonder what made the Mormons successful. I'll give you my opinion on what made them successful. Unlike the other communes, the Mormons were able to keep their women happy. Don't ask me how, but they managed. And by any standards of modern, not 2019 standards, the Mormons were sexist. But they did keep their women happy, and again, each of you can decide for yourself. Now, if I'm wrong, I know we're right here in the middle of a Mormon community, and I don't in any way mean to slam the Mormon group, the Mormon church. But if any of you know any more about the subject than I do, your input is welcome. If any of you disagree with it, your input is welcome also. Nobody? Okay. I'll be talking about the Mormons in a few minutes. But anyway, the communes. Rock Farm was a community for persons who wanted to write literary pursuits. The problem with Rock Farm is that these men would get together and think that, hey, but see, here's the problem. Somebody had to carry out the garbage. Somebody had to cut the grass. Somebody had to grow the crops. Somebody had to paint the walls. And these artists found out, any of you find if you start writing, you start doing these mundane tasks and you find no time to write. Finding time to write is extremely difficult, folk. Unless you're in prison, and then you might find all kinds of time, but even prisoners a lot of time have to work. But finding time to write. So these literary men joined Brock Farm, thinking it would help them write. Instead, one man said he had to leave because he was, I believe, Hemingway, one of the more famous writers, said I had to leave because I could not get any writing done at all for doing the chores that they assigned. Now, there was another community. I mean, most of these communities only lasted 2 or 3 years and they broke up. There was another community that lasted several years, and it was the Oneida community, where its inhabitants had free sex between all the members of the community. And again, I don't want to comment on that, except to say that it did not last extremely long. But it received the condemnation of people who lived outside it, very much so. But it survived throughout the 1850s, 1860s, and I don't know when it finally ended, several years after the Civil War was over. Church members, the women outnumbered the men in almost all churches 2 to 1, and yet the men were mostly the leaders in the church. The women began to push for more rights among the churches. Some churches gave the women the right to be preachers and some didn't. There is a movement on in some denominations to ordain women as priests, and others say no, that's a no-no. I mentioned Sojourner Truth. By the way, one of our Mars probes was named Sojourner after the Sojourner Truth, because the Mars probe had wheels that could go around the planet. And like Sojourner Truth went all over the South, or over a lot of the South, freeing slaves. Frederick Douglass also worked to end slavery. Some Northerners were in favor of slavery. A lot of black leaders rose to prominence. Some of them called for insurrection. But the black discrimination was actually in some ways worse in the North than it was in the South. While the North outlawed slavery, in the South, blacks and whites usually worshiped in the same church. In the North, even when I was a child, the blacks had their black churches and the whites had their white churches. And they worshiped in separate churches because they did not want the mixing of black and white. And when the race riots broke out in the 60s, they started in the South, Northerners pointed a finger, yeah, you deserve it, you're discriminatory. But then the race riots hit the northern cities with more fury than they ever hit the southern cities. I'm talking about Detroit, Michigan, Newark, New Jersey, Toledo, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, Middletown, Ohio. The race riots hit several northern cities, and one northern editor said, we apologize to you Southerners, because the North made the blacks more angry because the North is more hypocritical about it. I mean, a man who will tell you outright, I'm prejudiced, well, at least you know which side he's on. But a man who acts like I'm not prejudiced, and yet you find out later he really is, you hate that kind of man worse than you do a man who's honest and open about it. I see one person nodding your head. You understand what I'm saying. A couple of you nodding your head. But they wound up, the North was in some ways more segregated and more prejudiced than the South. There were a few black Americans, maybe 5%, who were free, and they were hated worse than the slaves. And they faced humiliation everywhere they went. A few states, though, in the North wound up giving blacks the right to vote. In 1855, Massachusetts integrated its public schools, the first state to do so and the only state to do so before the war.
Which state was that?
Massachusetts. More blacks escaped by heading west than escaped by heading north because they knew their masters would be looking for them in the north, and also the west had a bigger area. To go north, they had to go all the way to Canada, and Canada is a cold place. And your black people tend, now if I'm wrong you can tell me, tend to prefer a warmer climate than they would find in Canada. But so they oftentimes head west. And now, the doctrine of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny teaches that, or taught the people then that the United States, God-given destiny, that's what the word manifest means. It was clearly God's destiny that the United States expand from coast to coast. When I took world history in 1964 and 65 in high school, half of my classmates, most of them were older than I was. I took it as a 14-year-old sophomore. Most of my classmates were 15, 16, and 17. But half of them believed in manifest destiny still. But then when I student taught in 1972, in that 8-year period, I student taught American history, and not a one of the persons in any of my classes believed in manifest destiny. Or if they did, they wouldn't now. I'm not trying to push the doctrine. Again, it's somewhat of an outdated doctrine, but they believed that it was our duty to expand from coast to coast, and this was to lead to a big war with Mexico, and almost led to another war with Great Britain. The problem with Great Britain was that Great Britain and the United States both claimed, or what is today Oregon and Washington and Vancouver up in Canada, and that we both had an equal claim to that territory. So what we wound up doing was drawing a straight line, where the extending the line already was, and giving Canada Vancouver, and we took Washington and Oregon. So we basically split it in half. We thus averted a war with Great Britain, and we could not have afforded to fight Great Britain because at the time we were on the verge of fighting a war with Mexico. Now, Oregon. A lot of Americans then began to settle in Oregon. Oregon had a cold climate, but a lot of nice, good farmland. Now, there was a computer game called the Oregon Trail game. Have any of you played it? Okay, a few. When I was teaching a few years back, every one of my pupils practically had played it. Today, I don't think it's played as much. It started out, folks, as a DOS game with a floppy disk. And it went from being a DOS game to a Windows game. And went from being a Windows game to, well, first you had to buy one CD, then 2 CDs. Then finally it was a DVD, and I think the last time I checked, they had to load it in a computer on 2 different DVDs. They really made it elaborate. And I played with my 2 daughters some. My son had no interest in it. But it was pretty realistic. But anyway, people went to cross the Oregon Trail, and you had to leave at a certain time. If you left too late, the cold weather would set in and get you. If you left too early, the cold weather would also get you. You had to pick a good time to leave. Now, you could go part way and then settle down for the winter at a fort, which there were some forts along the way, including the famous Fort Laramie. And the Oregon Trail at one point broke away and became the California Trail, and some of it went to Oregon. So there were trails. There was a Chisholm Trail that led to Dodge City. It was mostly a cattle trail. And there's the Santa Fe Trail that led to Santa Fe, like I said, but there's Santa Fe like the name suggests. So there were these trails that led people west. This was before the invention of the railroad. Now, a lot of people began to push for the railroad, which was eventually to come, but the Civil War stopped the railroad from going to the Pacific Ocean for several years. The Plains Indians we had encountered were fierce fighters, particularly the Sioux Indians, the Paiute, the Comanche. They all were excellent fighters, and they were excellent horsemen. They got their horses from the Spanish. The white people brought 2 things to the Indians that wiped them out largely: alcohol and disease. Again, the Indians still had no immunity to smallpox and typhus, and alcohol continued to completely stupefy them. I don't know if a better word I can use, folks, but it just simply destroyed them. And they became strongly addicted to it to where they couldn't quit. The Indians also hurt themselves by fighting among themselves. The women would often go along on a trail with their husbands, but they had the hardest time on a trail. I mean, they had to do a lot of walking, and they'd get up in the morning and walk and walk and walk and camp for the night and get up the next day and do the same thing. But then came the mountains, and that was terribly rough on people going on the Oregon Trail. Now, into this scenario came another group, the Mormons. The Mormons were started by Joseph Smith. He claimed that he had a new revelation. He was persecuted and he was forced to move. At one point they lived in Indiana. But finally, a group of people just rose up and they killed Joseph Smith and a bunch of his followers. So Brigham Young took over. Brigham Young, there's a university named after him. He led them to Utah. They settled around Salt Lake City. And their descendants are still there. Utah is still largely controlled by the Mormons. Its politics has very much been in tune, in line with Mormon theology. But anyway, the Mormons eventually decided they wanted to become a state, and they applied for statehood. Their application for statehood was rejected, not because of the slavery issue, because by the time they applied, the slavery issue was settled, but because of the issue of polygamy. The Mormons used to teach that a man could have any number of wives, and this practice was frowned on by the rest of American society. Eventually, the Mormons changed this, and today I say this tongue-in-cheek, but the mainstream Mormons do not practice polygamy. Now, if you know of some that do, that's them, that's their business. But polygamy was an issue among them at one time. For the most part, the Mormons lived peacefully in Utah. Now, again, you have to take this tongue-in-cheek because the federal government sent some agents at one time to investigate the Mormons. All these agents died. The federal government sent more agents and they died. But then the federal government could not look into the matter any further because the Civil War broke out, and that took President Lincoln's entire attention. So basically, if the Mormons killed the federal agents, they got away with it. Got away with it clean because the federal government did not have the time or the resources to look into it further. All right. Now, Mexico. I'm going to write this here. This is me, my father, his father, 3 in a row. Then you get your woman. The name is Irish. Mary's father was Persifer Cassane. The name Cassane is not common. Now, Persifer Cassane was born in 1836. His father was named Richard Cassane, who was a college professor. But here's why I wanted to write this down. He had a twin brother named Persifer. Persifer Cassane died in 1836, so Richard named his next child after his fallen twin brother. How did Persifer die? He was killed at Goliad by the Mexican president Santa Anna, who simply lined up 365 Americans and slaughtered them, claiming they were pirates. So this is in the book. This man's name is not in the book. But anyway, when Richard Fish Cassane learned that his twin brother had been killed, he named his son after him and on down the line. Again, these names are Irish, with the name Cassane. Cunningham is Scottish. The name Cunningham is Scottish. All right. Do I still hold that against Santa Anna? Well, to some extent, folk, I guess I do. I mean, it's just simply wanton murder for no reason. The reason I bring this up partly is, to show that I am personally affected by this. But I had a history teacher in the 8th grade whom I admired greatly and learned a lot of history from. Conley was her name. I don't even know her for Mrs. Conley. But she was so hard against the Mexican War. But folk, if anything justified it, acts like this did. The Mexican War was started in large part by the Mexicans themselves. All right, now I'll go to tell the story. I mean, this is the middle of the story, not the beginning. Mexico got its independence from Spain in 1821. The Spanish were busy at the time recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, and during the time the Spain was fighting Napoleon, these nations began to get their independence one after another, and Mexico drove out the Spanish, and the Spanish didn't have enough strength to come back in. So Mexico was independent, and Mexico initially tried to establish good relations with the United States. In the meantime, Mexico could not get its people to move into what is today New Mexico, Arizona, California. Well, there were some that moved in, but these people were lawless. They began fighting among themselves. I'm talking about the Mexicans now who were living in what is today the United States, where they had to fight the Indians. When the Americans moved in, they mostly ignored the Mexicans, did not assimilate with the Mexicans. Well, a lot of Americans moved into Texas, including Richard Percifer Cassain here, Richard, twin brother. Percifer Cassain moved on. Another famous American was Davy Crockett, who had spent 6 years in Congress. Davy Crockett moved to Texas. Sam Bowie, inventor of the Bowie knife. Colonel Travis moved to Texas, and a whole bunch of them. Well, they brought their slaves with them, and Mexico had outlawed slavery. And folk, this is one time I have to side with the Mexicans. That Mexico tried to outlaw slavery, so the Americans said, oh, these are servants. They're not slaves, they're our servants. But in actuality, the Mexicans knew, and so did the black slaves, that they really were slaves. But Mexico tried to stop Americans from coming in by making slavery illegal. But again, this did not work. The Americans came in anyway. Finally, Santa Anna, who was known for his hatred of Americans, now that's his last two names. He actually had 4 names. He had 4 names, Lopez de Santa Anna or something like that. Anyway, Santa Anna was known for his hatred of Americans. He took over, and he began placing restrictions on Americans, among them that everybody had to join his church, which any of you who know anything about America knew that we did not want to be told which church to join, because Americans had not done that during the lifetime of anyone living then. Well, Texas rebelled. Santa Anna sent an army. The army had 3,400 men, and that was more than enough that he should easily have put down the revolt. Well, some Texans got trapped to the mission called the Alamo. The Alamo was made of stone walls that were pretty strong, that could withstand even the cannonballs that Santa Anna had. But anyway, there were 180 Texans surrounded at the Alamo. They were able to get an appeal out for help, but Sam Houston, who was more or less in charge, just with, there's nothing we can do, we can't help them. But these 180 Texans killed 1,800 Mexican soldiers, a ratio of 10 to 1, because the Mexicans marched straight and tall into battle like trained Europeans. And again, they were mowed down, but they were outnumbered, the Mexicans outnumbered them 3,400 to 180. So every one of the Texans were killed. It has been said that Davy Crockett was one of the 5 left, and he surrendered, and Santa Anna lined the 5 of them up and shot them dead. Which is not the thing you do normally in wartime, but Santa Anna was not abiding by the rules of war. Then Santa Anna bumped into these men at Goliad who were not rebellious, and he said, "You're pirates," and he slaughtered all 365 of them, including my ancestor's brother. No good reason to slaughter them. This made a lot of Americans very angry. Now, folk, if you try to understand why did we fight the Mexican War, it was not so much greed. A lot of people were related to these people who were killed at Goliad. I mean, the Alamo, okay, that was war. Goliad, that was simply murder. People who were not even fighting. By this time, Sam Houston rounded up 750 men. Now, all right, Santa Anna still had 1,600 men left. Okay, but Santa Anna was in some ways not very smart. He took a siesta one afternoon. Now, folk, any doctor might tell you that the idea of taking a siesta is a good idea. Someone, what's a siesta? Siesta is where you take a couple hours off in the afternoon during a hot part of the day and sleep. And the rest of the day, you're wide awake. You're awake, alert, and mentally sharp. A lot of doctors say it promotes longer life and is a good idea, but it's not a good idea to do when you don't know where your enemy is. He went and took this siesta with no guards, no scouts. I mean, he should have sent scouts around to be looking around. not realizing Sam Houston was just over the hill with 700 men. Once they were all bedded down and sound asleep, Sam Houston's men started shouting, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad! Remember the Alamo!" And they started swooping down the hill. Santa Anna was seen in his purple underwear, running pell-mell from the scene. And anybody who's been in the military situation knows when you see your leader run fast off the scene of battle, guess what the Army does? Santa Anna was the commander-in-chief. He should have tried to get the men to line up, get in formation quickly, hurry up. Instead, the men did not have their boots on, did not have their rifles. They should have slept with their boots on, folks. They should have slept so they could get into formation instantly. They didn't. Santa Anna took off running. So did his entire army. So the the Texans went around and rounding them up. And one of the men they rounded up was Santa Anna, but the Texans who did not recognize him until they got him in the corral where the other Mexicans were. And all of a sudden, when everybody in the corral started running towards Santa Anna, they were, "Hey, this is their leader." Well, they took Santa Anna to Sam Houston. Sam Houston had been wounded in the leg, but they took us to Houston. Santa Anna tried to be a good sport about it, but he knew, and he did. He signed the document that gave Texas its independence, and he had to leave all of his artillery and ammunition. This was standard procedure. He had to leave behind all of his artillery and all of his ammunition. Sam Houston gave him and his army what was left of an escort to the border, and once in Mexico, the Mexicans took care of Santa Anna for a while. They sent him into exile, and for 9 years, Santa Anna remained in exile. Now, he was to make a comeback, but for 9 years, he had to live in exile because the Mexicans saw that he was weak and rebelled against him. Now, I had a sister one time who asked me, why didn't Sam Houston just slaughter the entire Mexican army? And I said, the only reason I can figure was that Sam Houston and the men who were with him were not wicked enough to just slaughter some helpless, innocent men. Besides, it would have created more bad blood between the United States and Mexico than there already was. But they had, like I said, they had to leave their weapons behind, but he let them go. So for the next 9 years, Texas was independent. From 1836 to 1845, Texas was an independent state, and it's today called the Lone Star State. Their flag has 1 star on it. Well, the Texans wanted to be part of the United States right away because they could not manage their economy, and they felt like if they could become part of the United States would help them economically, and also they wanted to be part of the greatest nation in the world. So Texas applied for statehood. They were denied, owing to the fact that they were a slave state and they would have had to come into the Union as a slave state because the people there wanted them. So Texas had to wait. Now, eventually another state came in, and offset it, but Texas was finally admitted in 1845, 9 years later. Sam Houston became the first president of Texas and later became the governor of Texas. All right. Now, we come back to politics. When William Henry Harrison died, for the first time in history, a vice president took over the office, John Tyler. Some people thought that Tyler would become just a figurehead and fill in and follow the lead of the party and go along with it. No. Tyler proved once and for all that a vice president has all the powers of a president, and he's not obligated in any way to follow in the footsteps of the president who preceded him. The Whigs passed a bunch of legislation that Tyler did not approve of, and Tyler vetoed it. Tyler had never been a Whig. The only thing he had to agree with the Whig was he did not like Andrew Jackson, but other than that, he was not a Whig. The Whig Party read him out of the party, the only time in history that a party has read its president out of it, but the Whigs read him out of the party, and he goes down in history as an unusual president that turned against the party that elected him. Nevertheless, every one of his cabinet resigned except for Daniel Webster, who stayed on to negotiate the treaty that gave us Washington, Oregon, and gave Great Britain Vancouver. Again, this was necessary because we could not fight both Mexico and Great Britain. Well, eventually it was decided that Oregon could come into the Union as a free state, and Texas is a slave state. So Texas became the 15th slave state, and Oregon eventually was admitted also on a promise that they would be, and they finally were. And Oregon, of course, being far north, was admitted as a free state. All right, this brings us up to the Mexican War. President Polk wanted the territory of